Human history is a long and bloody epic, where wars have not only redrawn borders, but also shaped the fate of nations and the order of the world. Some battles transcend the simple notion of victory or defeat. They ignite new eras, forever changing the map of politics, culture, and human thought. From the fields of ancient Greece, across the arid deserts of the Middle East, to the brutal battlefields of Europe and Asia, history has witnessed moments where the clash of swords and the fires of war define the world we live in today. In this video, we revisit the battles that changed the course of human history, battles that did not merely decide the rise or fall of empires, but forged turning points that irreversibly shaped civilization itself. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to continue joining us on these captivating journeys through history. And now, let us begin with the very first battle. The Battle of Gaugamela, 331 BC. Before this battle, the Persian Empire stood as the most powerful force in the known world, while the Kingdom of Macedonia was seen as small and insignificant. Yet on the plains of Gaugamela, everything changed. It was here that Alexander the Great began his legendary march of conquest. Outnumbered nearly 5-1, 47,000 Macedonian troops against 200,000 Persians, Alexander demonstrated his genius in command, employing tactics that generals would study for centuries to come. At the center stood the traditional phalanx, its soldiers armed with the fearsome sarissa, a pike reaching nearly 5 meters in length. Meanwhile, Alexander introduced the shock cavalry, a decisive force never before seen in warfare. The phalanx smashed into the Persian infantry head-on, while Alexander himself led the Macedonian cavalry in a daring strike against the Persian flank and center. Overwhelmed, King Darius III panicked and fled. Witnessing their ruler abandon the battlefield, the Persian army collapsed in chaos, sealing their defeat. The victory at Gaugamela marked the beginning of the end for the ancient Persian Empire and the dawn of Alexander's world-spanning dominion. His warriors, with their sarissas and invincible cavalry, carved their names into the chronicles of history. Significance: for the first time, a small Greek kingdom rose up to defeat one of the greatest empires on earth. This triumph ignited the rise of Alexander's empire, stretching from Greece to India, and stamped the legacy of Greek civilization across Central Asia. The Battle of Zama, 202 BC. For centuries, Rome and Carthage had been the two dominant powers of the ancient Mediterranean. And in the Second Punic War, the bloodiest of them all, history witnessed the clash of two military geniuses, Hannibal and Scipio Africanus. This was the battle that would decide the fate of both civilizations. Hannibal, the terror of Rome, had once struck fear into the Republic with his legendary victory at Cannae. But at Zama, he faced Scipio, the young Roman commander who had already defeated Carthage's armies in Iberia, opening the road to Carthage itself. Hannibal chose Zama as his battlefield, believing he could unleash the full power of his cavalry and war elephants. Yet Scipio had studied Hannibal's tactics in detail, preparing his legions to neutralize the elephant's charge. More than that, he held a decisive advantage. The Numidian cavalry, once allies of Carthage, now fighting for Rome, the fastest and deadliest light horsemen of the age. When the battle began, the elephants faltered. Startled by horns and volleys of javelins, many turned back, trampling Hannibal's own troops. Meanwhile, the Numidian and Roman cavalry struck with speed, scattering Carthage's horsemen and encircling the infantry. The Carthaginian army was surrounded, crushed, and Hannibal was defeated. Glory belonged to Scipio and to Rome. The Battle of Zama ended Carthage's status as Rome's equal. From that moment on, the Western Mediterranean belonged to Rome, laying the foundation for the rise of the mighty Roman Empire in the centuries to come. The Battle of Chalons, 451 AD, Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, had swept across Europe in a storm of conquest and terror. Now at Chalons, he stood on the brink of ultimate victory, the chance to claim the entire continent. Against him stood the last guardians of Western civilization, the Western Roman Empire, allied with Germanic tribes such as the Visigoths and the Alans, under the command of the seasoned general Flavius Aetius. They knew that if Attila was not stopped here, the fate of Europe would be sealed in ruin. On the Catalonian plains of northern France, the armies deployed in three wings. On the left, Roman legions and Franks clashed with the Gepids, vassals of the Huns. On the right, Visigoths faced their rivals, the Ostrogoths. At the center, the Alans met the Hun cavalry, led by Attila himself. At first, the Hun center surged forward, driving back the Alans with heavy losses. But on the flanks, the balance shifted. The Gepids could not break the Romans, and the Visigoths pushed back the Ostrogoths, threatening Attila's side. Forced to act, he diverted troops to reinforce the collapsing line, saving the Alans from destruction. In the chaos, King Theodoric of the Visigoths was slain. Yet instead of faltering, his warriors fought with vengeance, shattering the Ostrogoths and the reinforcements, then turning against the Hun center. For the first time in his life, Attila fled the battlefield. Chalon marked Attila's first great defeat. The Roman-German alliance had halted the Huns' advance and preserved Europe from conquest. The victory did more than defend borders. It safeguarded European culture and the Christian faith from the storm of the Asian steppe. The Battle of Yarmouk, 636 AD. The 7th century witnessed the first great wave of Islamic expansion under the Prophet Muhammad, and after him, the caliphs of the Rashidun dynasty. Having conquered the Arabian Peninsula, their next targets were the lands of the Sassanid Empire and the holy territories of Palestine and Syria, then held by the Byzantine Empire. Sensing the danger, Emperor Heraclius mustered his armies to strike back. In a dramatic turn, the Byzantines and their old enemies, the Sassanids, even considered a temporary alliance against the Muslims. Facing threats on two fronts, the Muslims secured peace with the Sassanids to focus entirely on the Byzantine challenge. In the summer of 636, the two armies met on the plains of Yarmouk, terrain perfectly suited for cavalry warfare. What followed was one of the most brilliant displays of mounted combat in military history. The Byzantine force, commanded by Vahan, numbered between 20,000 and 40,000 by modern estimates, perhaps 100,000 in ancient accounts. Arrayed against them stood just 15,000 to 20,000 Muslims, 40,000 by older chronicles, led by the legendary Khalid ibn al-Walid, the Sword of Allah. For days, the Byzantines pressed their advantage, but each time the Muslims fell back, Khalid's swift cavalry swept into their flanks, forcing retreats. Lightly armed, fast, and highly maneuverable, the Muslim horsemen dictated the rhythm of the battle. After 4 days of fruitless combat, both sides paused. On the 6th day, Khalid saw his chance. The Byzantine army, exhausted and demoralized, still clung to its rigid formations. Khalid massed all his cavalry on one wing. As the infantry locked in combat, his horsemen stormed into the Byzantine left. Shocked and unprepared, the flank collapsed, panic spread, and chaos engulfed the army. Byzantine cavalry tried to rally, but it was too late. The Muslim counterattack broke the entire line. The Byzantines fled into the ravines, only to be ambushed by Muslim detachments placed there in advance. The battle ended in total disaster. Muslim losses were light, while the Byzantines lost nearly half their force. Significance: Yarmouk was a decisive blow to Byzantium. It delivered Palestine and Jerusalem into Muslim hands, securing Islam's enduring presence in the Holy Land. In the years that followed, Muslim armies swept across the region. Egypt fell in 642, the Sassanid Empire collapsed by 651, and the crescent banners of Islam stretched from North Africa to India, even threatening the gates of Constantinople itself. The Battle of Tours, 732 AD. Nearly a century after Yarmouk, Islam had grown into a vast and powerful faith, stretching across the Middle East and North Africa. Its rise threatened the very survival of Christianity. In the 8th century, under the caliphs of the Umayyad dynasty, Muslim armies crossed into Europe, conquering the Iberian Peninsula, toppling the Visigothic kingdom, and pressing north toward the lands of the Franks and Burgundy. The Muslim army swept forward like an unstoppable storm, its cavalry the terror of Europe. In this moment of crisis, the hopes of Christendom rested on Charles Martel, the Frankish mayor of the palace, and his battle-hardened northern soldiers. In 732, the Muslim host advanced into the region of Tours in northern France. Outnumbered, Charles Martel knew that facing them in open battle would be suicide. Instead, he chose high ground, positioning his men on a wooded hill where the trees broke the charge of enemy cavalry and concealed his ranks. For days, wave after wave of Muslim assaults crashed against the Frankish line and failed. The unthinkable was happening. The feared Muslim cavalry could not break the steadfast Christian infantry. Frustrated, the Umayyad commanders ordered a full assault, throwing their entire force against Charles's line. This was the moment Martel had prepared for. As the enemy cavalry pressed forward, small Frankish detachments struck the nearly abandoned Muslim camp, burning supplies, seizing treasure, and freeing captives. Seeing their camp in flames, many Muslim soldiers broke off to defend it. Those left in the battle line thought the army was collapsing and panicked. Confusion turned to rout. That night, the Muslim army retreated, leaving the field to Charles Martel. Against all odds, Christianity had survived. Significance? Tours was the turning point that preserved Christianity in Europe and halted the Muslim advance. It was a classic triumph of infantry defense, one that immortalized Charles Martel and laid the foundation for his grandson, Charlemagne, to build the mighty Carolingian Empire. The fall of Constantinople, 1453 AD. It was the greatest defeat of Christendom at the hands of Islam, the end of more than 1,000 years of the Byzantine Empire. Once a mighty realm, Byzantium had shrunk to a small enclave around its ancient capital, Constantinople, surrounded on all sides by enemies. For centuries, Constantinople's massive walls had stood unbroken, the ultimate fortress of Eastern Christendom. But now the balance had shifted. The Ottomans unveiled colossal cannons, designed by the Hungarian engineer Orban, each weighing 16 tons, powerful enough to shatter the once impregnable defenses. Sensing opportunity, Sultan Mehmed II launched his great gamble, the conquest of the Byzantine capital. Western Europe recognized the danger. If Constantinople fell, all of Europe might be threatened. Yet Europe was divided. The Holy Roman Empire was not unified. England and France were still locked in the 100 Years' War, and the Pope's call for aid mustered only a few thousand mercenaries from Italy, far too little against the vast Ottoman host. On April 6, 1453, Mehmed's army laid siege to the city. For 53 days and nights, the defenders held on. But one by one, the mighty walls cracked under the thunder of Ottoman artillery. On May 29th, Constantinople was overrun. The jewel of Christendom became the capital of the Ottoman Empire. After more than a millennium, Byzantium was no more. Significance: the fall of Constantinople flung open the gates of Europe to the Ottomans, casting a shadow of fear that would linger until the 19th century. Yet it also carried an unintended consequence. Byzantine scholars and artisans fled westward, bringing with them the treasures of Greek and Roman knowledge. In Italy, their wisdom helped spark a cultural rebirth, the dawn of the Renaissance. The Battle of Lepanto, 1571 AD. It was one of the greatest naval victories of Christendom against the Ottoman Empire. A century after the fall of Constantinople, the Ottomans had mastered the Eastern Mediterranean, crushing rivals including the Republic of Venice, and now sought to conquer the West, aiming for total dominance of the sea. To stop them, a holy league was forged under the Pope, led by Habsburg Spain, Venice, and several Italian states. Their combined fleet matched the Ottomans in size. The Ottomans held superiority in numbers and skilled archers, but the Holy League possessed a decisive advantage: The galleass, massive war galleys armed with heavy cannon, a revolutionary weapon at sea. On October 7, 1571, the two fleets clashed in the Gulf of Lepanto. The battle was ferocious. Galleys ramming, soldiers fighting hand-to-hand, while the galleasses unleashed devastating broadsides into the Ottoman line. The turning point came when the Ottoman flagship, commanded by Ali Pasha, was surrounded. Ali Pasha was killed, and his severed head was hoisted on a Christian mast. Morale across the Ottoman fleet collapsed. Seizing the moment, the Holy League poured fire into the disordered enemy, annihilating nearly the entire Ottoman navy. The waters of Lepanto ran red with wreckage and blood. Significance: Lepanto halted the Ottoman advance at sea. Though the empire remained formidable on land, its navy never recovered its former strength. The battle also marked the end of the galley era and the dawn of a new age in naval warfare, the age of gunpowder warships. The Battle of Vienna, 1683 AD. In 1453, Constantinople had fallen. The gateway to Europe stood wide open for the Ottoman Empire. Over the next 2 centuries, the Ottomans swept through the Balkans, crushed the Kingdom of Hungary, and pressed against the borders of the Holy Roman Empire under the Habsburgs. Their ultimate goal was clear: Vienna, the Habsburg capital, the same city they had failed to capture in 1529. This time, their power was overwhelming. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha marched at the head of nearly 150,000 men, the largest Ottoman host ever to threaten Europe. Panic gripped the city. Emperor Leopold I fled to Passau with 60,000 civilians. Prince Charles withdrew with 20,000 soldiers. Inside Vienna, only about 11,000 troops and 5,000 militia remained to withstand the siege. If Vienna fell, Christendom itself might collapse. Recognizing the danger, Pope Innocent IV called for aid. He placed command in the hands of King Jan III Sobieski of Poland, who led a relief force of Poles, Germans, and Austrians to save the city. Meanwhile, the Ottomans pressed their siege, battering Vienna's walls. The city's fortifications held firm, and Kara Mustafa's hesitation proved costly. He avoided devastating assaults in hopes of preserving Vienna's wealth intact. That indecision allowed the defenders to cling on, even as their strength waned. When the relief army finally arrived, the Ottomans faced a dire choice: abandon the siege to confront Sobieski or seize Vienna before reinforcements struck. They chose to press the attack, but Sobieski, observing from the hills, made a bold decision. He unleashed 20,000 Polish winged hussars in a single, thunderous charge. With their angelic wings streaming behind them, they led the largest cavalry charge in history, smashing into the Ottoman lines. Caught by surprise, the Ottomans fell into chaos. The garrison inside Vienna surged out to join the assault. Exhausted by weeks of fighting, the Ottoman army broke, routed, and fled. Vienna was saved. Christendom had triumphed. Significance: the victory at Vienna shattered the Ottoman dream of conquering Europe. It forced the Sultan into peace, secured Christianity's survival, and gave the Habsburgs the momentum to reclaim Hungary and drive the Ottomans back into the Balkans. The battle also left a cultural legacy: the croissant, shaped after the crescent moon of the Ottoman flag, the bagel, symbol of Polish cavalry, and cappuccino, born from coffee captured in the Ottoman camp. The Battle of Saratoga, 1777 AD. Saratoga is remembered as the battle that gave birth to America, a turning point not only in the War of Independence, but in world history. In the 18th century, 13 North American colonies rose up against the British Empire, the most powerful force of its time. At first, Britain's professional army swept aside the inexperienced colonials, but the Americans adapted, turning to guerrilla tactics, ambushes, raids, and hit-and-run attacks that bled the redcoats and wore them down. In 1777, Britain launched a campaign to seize Saratoga, New York, hoping to cut the colonies in two. Instead, the plan collapsed into disaster. Though they won some initial engagements, British troops suffered heavy losses and found themselves encircled. After more than 2 weeks of fighting, Exhausted, cut off from supplies, and with no way out, the British Army was forced to surrender to the Americans. Significance. For the first time, a professional British Army laid down its arms to a colonial force, made up largely of farmers and volunteers. Saratoga was the decisive turning point of the revolution. It convinced France to enter the war directly, transforming a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. From Saratoga began the path to final victory and the birth of a new nation that would change the course of world history. The Battle of Trafalgar, 1805 AD, widely regarded as one of the most important naval battles in human history, Trafalgar pitted the Royal Navy against its two greatest rivals, France and Spain. What began as a strategic encounter would not only shape the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars, but also alter the balance of global power for the next century. At the time, France under Napoleon possessed the strongest land army in the world. His ultimate ambition was the invasion of Britain, the only major enemy yet untouched by his armies, in order to cut off British support to the continental coalitions. But first, he had to break the last barrier, the Royal Navy, commanded by the legendary Admiral Horatio Nelson. France allied with Spain to form a combined fleet. In October 1805, as this armada left Cadiz, it was shadowed by the British. Forced into confrontation, Admiral Villeneuve prepared to fight off Cape Trafalgar, despite his reluctance for a decisive engagement. The Allies deployed 41 ships in the traditional line formation. They boasted 4 first-rate ships of the line, the largest in the world, including Spain's Santísima Trinidad, carrying 130 guns. The British, though fielding only 3 first-rates, had 4 powerful second-rates, giving them a crucial edge in heavy firepower. Nelson unveiled a tactic that would rewrite naval warfare. He split his fleet into 2 columns, sailing directly into the enemy line. One column was led by Vice Admiral Collingwood aboard HMS Royal Sovereign, the other by Nelson himself on HMS Victory, bearing down on Villeneuve's flagship, the Bucentaure. It was a daring gamble. With calm winds slowing their approach, British ships endured heavy fire. Victory even lost her rudder. But once in range, the British unleashed devastating broadsides, cutting the enemy line into 3 isolated sections. Each British ship could fire from both broadsides while their opponents could only fire from one. The effect was overwhelming. The Franco-Spanish fleet faltered. Flagships were shattered, crews surrendered, and the Allies collapsed under the relentless assault. As Nelson's columns passed through and doubled back, the enemy fleet was encircled and annihilated. The price was heavy. Admiral Nelson himself was struck down in battle. With his dying breath, he uttered the immortal words, "Thank God I've done my duty." After 5 hours of fighting, the Royal Navy stood victorious, capturing or sinking 21 enemy ships without losing a single vessel. Significance. Trafalgar was the decisive naval victory of the Napoleonic Wars. It destroyed French and Spanish sea power, secured Britain's command of the oceans for the next century, and ushered in the golden era of Pax Britannica. At the same time, the battle closed the age of sail and heralded the dawn of steam, a technological leap that would transform the course of human history. The Battle of Leipzig, 1813 AD. Many remember Waterloo as the battle that ended Napoleon's reign. But in truth, his empire had already crumbled 2 years earlier. At Leipzig, the greatest defeat of his military career. In the early 19th century, Napoleon's Grande Armée had dominated Europe, crushing Austria, humbling Prussia, and building a continental empire. Yet after the disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812, he paid the ultimate price. More than 2/3 of his army was lost. Former enemies rose again. To the west, British and Spanish forces pushed into France. To the east, the coalition of Russia, Austria, and Prussia, now joined by Sweden, pressed relentlessly forward. Seeking to break the eastern advance, Napoleon massed his forces at Leipzig, a vital supply hub. But the Grande Armée was no longer what it once was. His seasoned veterans lay buried in the snows of Russia, replaced now by raw recruits with little training. Worse still, the numbers were overwhelming. 190,000 French against 430,000 coalition troops. Napoleon's only hope lay in the fragile unity of his enemies. But this time, the coalition had learned from past humiliations at Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, and Dresden. For 2 days, the French fought fiercely, even launching counterattacks. But gradually, the weight of numbers told. The struggle became a war of attrition that the coalition was destined to win. On the third day, the arrival of Crown Prince Charles John of Sweden, once a French marshal, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, sealed Napoleon's fate. His troops joined the coalition in a vast encirclement of the French army. Demoralized and exhausted, French soldiers began to desert, surrender, even defect. Napoleon ordered a retreat, but disaster struck. The only bridge out of Leipzig was blown too soon, leaving thousands trapped, drowned, or captured. Leipzig, forever remembered as the Battle of the Nations, ended in catastrophe for France. It was the decisive triumph of Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Sweden, forcing Napoleon's first abdication in 1814. If Waterloo marked the final curtain, Leipzig was the crushing blow that destroyed his empire. Significance. After Leipzig, the mantle of European power shifted to Prussia and Russia. For the German people, it was the beginning of a new chapter, the liberation of the southern states from French rule, and the first steps toward the unification of Germany. The Second Battle of the Marne, 1918. By 1918, the final year of the First World War, the situation for the Allies was dire. In the east, Russia had withdrawn after the Bolshevik Revolution. Romania had been defeated. Italy was in collapse. And though the United States had declared war, American troops had yet to fully arrive. After 4 years of trench warfare, the British and French were exhausted. Their armies stretched to the breaking point. Sensing opportunity, Germany launched the Spring Offensive of 1918, also known as the Ludendorff Offensive. 500,000 troops were shifted from the Eastern Front to the West. The plan was simple: crush the Allies before the Americans could tip the balance. At first it worked. German stormtroopers smashed through trenches, driving deep into Allied lines. For a moment, Paris seemed within reach. But in May, the tide began to turn. Ferdinand Foch, Chief of Staff of the French Army, was appointed Supreme Allied Commander. Under unified command, the Allies stabilized. The Germans captured ground, but it was territory of little strategic value, and they lacked the strength to hold it. In June, German forces crossed the Aisne, pushing to within 100 kilometers of Paris. By July, they stood at the Marne River, only 40 kilometers from the French capital. Panic swept Paris. Marshal Philippe Pétain rushed in reserves, while Foch committed the American Expeditionary Force. Fresh, unbloodied, and full of vigor, the Americans bolstered the weary Allies. The Germans broke the initial defenses and crossed the Marne. But their advance stalled against stubborn American and French resistance. By then, Germany was bleeding dry, resources depleted, soldiers exhausted by 4 years of war and months of relentless marching. On July 18, 1918, Foch struck back. From the north, the French 10th Army under General Charles Martel, nicknamed the Butcher for his audacious tactics, slammed into the German flank and center. At the same time, French defenders and American troops launched a massive counteroffensive. Shocked and outmaneuvered, the Germans retreated in disarray across the Marne. Attempts to regroup along the Vesle failed. Significance. The Second Battle of the Marne was the decisive turning point of World War I. It marked the collapse of German hopes for victory. 3 months later, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, the German Empire fell, and the Great War came to an end. From its ashes emerged a new world order, one that would shape the course of the 20th century. The Battle of Stalingrad, 1942 to 1943. No words can fully capture the brutality of Stalingrad, the bloodiest battle in human history. Lasting over 8 months, it claimed more than 1 million lives and turned the city on the Volga into a graveyard of armies. After defeating France, Nazi Germany turned east to destroy its greatest enemy, the Soviet Union. In 1941, Operation Barbarossa was launched. In the opening months, disaster struck the Red Army. Defenses collapsed, countless units were encircled and annihilated. By winter, German forces stood at the gates of Moscow. But the bitter cold, the same force that had broken Napoleon, saved Russia. Under Georgy Zhukov, Siberian divisions counterattacked, driving the Germans back. Blitzkrieg had failed, yet Hitler pressed on. In 1942, he shifted south, aiming for the Caucasus, the breadbasket and oil fields of the Soviet Union. But first, he vowed to capture a city that bore Stalin's name, Stalingrad. Industrial hub, transport artery, and symbol of prestige, its fall would cripple Soviet morale. By July, the Germans reached the city. The Luftwaffe rained bombs, reducing Stalingrad to rubble. Yet amid the ruins, the Soviets held firm. Every street, every building, every cellar became a fortress. Not one step back, went the order. Red Army soldiers clung to the Germans at close quarters, neutralizing their firepower advantage. The battle devolved into savage house-to-house combat, fought over meters of ground at horrific cost. By October, the Germans controlled 90% of the city, but winter had returned, their troops exhausted, supply lines overstretched. Then came the Soviet counterstroke. In November, 7 Soviet armies struck in Operation Uranus, sweeping through the weak Italian and Romanian allies on the flanks and encircling more than 300,000 Germans inside Stalingrad. Cut off from supplies, the trapped Germans withered. Luftwaffe airlifts failed. Hitler ordered them to stand fast. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, trapped between Berlin's demands and battlefield reality, watched his army collapse. By January 1943, the last airfield had fallen. With no hope left, Paulus surrendered. Stalingrad was a Soviet victory, but at staggering cost. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers and civilians dead or wounded, an industrial city reduced to ash. For Germany, nearly an entire army was destroyed. Significance: Stalingrad was the turning point of the Eastern Front and of the Second World War itself. From defense, the Soviets seized the initiative, paving the way for decisive victories like Kursk. Once again, Russia's brutal winter had become its greatest ally, as it had against Napoleon. Stalingrad gave the Soviet Union and communism the foothold to endure and crushed the Nazi dream of domination, forever reshaping the fate of the world. Human history has been shaped not only by great civilizations and groundbreaking inventions, but also by the clash of swords and the smoke of war. From the plains of Gaugamela to the banks of the Marne and through the shattered ruins of Stalingrad, each battle left an indelible mark. They did not merely decide the fate of a kingdom or an empire. They opened turning points that reshaped the course of human civilization itself. Glorious victories and bitter defeats alike carry lessons: military strength, strategic genius, and the unyielding will of human beings combined to write epic chapters of history, chapters drenched in both triumph and tragedy. Above all, these battles remind us that peace has never been a given. It is the outcome of sacrifice and the terrible cost paid by generations before us. Today, as we look back, we see more than just the past. We see a warning for the present and the future, that history can repeat itself should humanity forget the lessons written in fire and blood.